As we enter the final week of January 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States has just concluded one of the most consequential oral arguments in its modern history concerning the architecture of American economic governance. On Wednesday, January 21st, all 9 justices, across ideological lines, subjected the Trump administration's legal team to over 2 hours of skeptical questioning regarding the president's claimed authority to remove Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook from her position on the central bank's Board of Governors. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, a Trump appointee himself, articulated what many in the courtroom understood to be the core stakes when he warned that accepting the administration's position would effectively weaken, if not shatter, the independence of the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell sat in the gallery that morning, watching proceedings that would likely determine whether he himself would be next. Powell is currently under criminal investigation by the Justice Department, a probe he has publicly characterized as a pretext masking the true motivation, namely the administration's frustration over interest rates the Fed has declined to cut as aggressively as the White House desires. I am not a financial advisor. This is not financial advice. This is an educational analysis based on publicly available information and historical precedent. What unfolded in that courtroom represents something far more significant than a dispute over a single Fed governor's employment status. It represents the structural collision between political short-termism and institutional durability, between the immediate demands of electoral politics and the mathematical realities of monetary stability. To understand why the justices appeared to recognize the gravity of this moment, one must understand the machinery by which modern economies sustain themselves and the historical record of what happens when that machinery is dismantled for political convenience. The Federal Reserve System was established in 1913 under circumstances that seem almost quaint by today's standards. The United States had experienced a series of financial panics, the most severe being the Panic of 1907, which required the personal intervention of J.P. Morgan to prevent a complete collapse of the banking system. The lesson drawn from that episode was that a mature industrial economy required a central institution capable of providing liquidity in times of crisis and moderating the extremes of economic cycles without reference to partisan political considerations. The Federal Reserve Act provided that governors would serve 14-year terms, deliberately spanning multiple presidential administrations, and could only be removed for cause. In the 112 years since that founding, no president had ever attempted to fire a sitting Fed governor until August 2025, when President Trump announced on social media that he was terminating Lisa Cook. The constitutional and economic reasoning behind central bank independence is not a matter of abstract academic debate. It emerges from the observable mathematics of inflation dynamics and the historical record of nations that have permitted political actors to control monetary policy for short-term electoral gain. At the center of this reasoning is a fundamental insight about the nature of inflation expectations. When economic actors, meaning households, businesses, workers, and investors, form expectations about future inflation, those expectations become partially self-fulfilling. If businesses expect prices to rise, they build that expectation into their pricing decisions today. If workers expect their purchasing power to erode, they demand higher wages now. If investors expect the currency to depreciate, they demand higher interest rates to compensate for that risk. This creates what economists call an inflation expectations anchor. When that anchor is firmly set, meaning when participants in the economy genuinely believe that the central bank will maintain price stability regardless of political pressure, inflation tends to remain contained even during supply shocks and economic disruptions. The mechanism by which political interference destroys this anchor is straightforward but devastating. Politicians operate on electoral timelines. Interest rate cuts provide immediate economic stimulus, lower borrowing costs for consumers and businesses, boost asset prices, and create a general sense of economic well-being. Interest rate increases do the opposite, at least in the short term. No politician seeking re-election voluntarily embraces the electoral consequences of economic contraction, even when such contraction is necessary to prevent far greater damage from accelerating inflation. When markets perceive that monetary policy has become subordinate to political considerations, they rationally adjust their inflation expectations upward, recognizing that no administration will permit the central bank to take sufficiently aggressive action to control inflation when doing so conflicts with electoral imperatives. This adjustment in expectations then feeds through into actual pricing behavior, validating the expectations and creating an inflationary spiral that becomes progressively more expensive to break. The historical evidence for this mechanism is not theoretical. It is written in the economic wreckage of nations that ignored it. Consider the United States itself during the 1970s, the only peacetime decade in American history when inflation became entrenched at damaging levels for an extended period. The proximate cause of that inflationary spiral is often attributed to the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, but the deeper structural cause lay in the compromised independence of the Federal Reserve during the Nixon administration. Arthur Burns, appointed Fed chairman by Nixon in 1970, was a distinguished economist who had written extensively about the dangers of inflation. He was also a friend of the president and susceptible to political pressure in ways that would prove catastrophic. The Nixon White House tapes, released years later, revealed the explicit pressure Nixon applied to Burns to maintain loose monetary policy ahead of the 1972 election. The tapes capture Nixon instructing Burns to ensure the money supply expanded, with Nixon telling Burns directly to get it up and kick it. Burns complied. Unemployment drifted downward ahead of the election. Nixon won by a historic landslide. And within 2 years, inflation had begun its decade-long spiral, rising from around 4% to eventually peak above 13% by 1980. The cost of breaking that inflation was borne not by Nixon, who had resigned in disgrace over unrelated matters, but by the American public. When Paul Volcker became Fed chairman in 1979, he confronted an inflation rate that had become embedded in economic expectations after years of inadequate policy responses. The only way to re-anchor expectations was to demonstrate that the Federal Reserve would prioritize price stability regardless of political consequences. Volcker raised interest rates to nearly 20%, triggering what was at that time the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment rose above 10%. Home builders mailed unused lumber to the Federal Reserve headquarters in Washington. Auto dealers sent keys to vehicles they could not sell. Farmers drove tractors around the Fed building in protest, but Volcker held firm, and by 1983, inflation had retreated to just over 3%, where it would remain largely contained for the next 4 decades. What Volcker understood, and what the Supreme Court justices questioning the Trump administration appeared to grasp on Wednesday, is that the value of central bank independence is not primarily about preventing bad individual decisions. It is about maintaining the credibility structure that allows good monetary policy to function at all. A central bank that can be pressured into accommodation by political authorities loses the ability to anchor expectations, even when it wishes to pursue appropriate policy. The market's rational response to a politically captured central bank is to assume that accommodation will always be forthcoming when politically necessary, regardless of what current policy appears to be. This is why central bank independence, once compromised, is extraordinarily difficult to restore. As researcher Carolina Garriga at the University of Essex has documented, once you demonstrate that the institution is unable to control political meddling, the long-term trust in the institutions is damaged. And rebuilding that trust requires not just policy changes, but a demonstrated track record spanning years or even decades. The international evidence on this point is unambiguous and sobering. Turkey provides perhaps the clearest recent example. President Erdogan spent years publicly criticizing the Turkish central bank for maintaining interest rates he considered too high. pressuring the institution to cut rates even as inflation accelerated. In 2018, constitutional changes allowed Erdogan to effectively gain removal power over the central bank governor. He proceeded to fire 3 governors between 2019 and 2021 for refusing to cut rates to his satisfaction. The result was entirely predictable to anyone familiar with monetary economics. Inflation, which had averaged around 14% before these interventions, exploded to over 60% by 2022 and 2023. The Turkish lira collapsed against major currencies. Ordinary Turks watched their savings evaporate as the purchasing power of their currency disintegrated. The Turkish economy now faces years, possibly decades, of painful adjustment to restore monetary credibility. Argentina offers an even longer historical record of the consequences of central bank politicization. The country's central bank was granted formal independence multiple times throughout the 20th century, only to have that independence overridden whenever fiscal pressures made monetary accommodation politically convenient. In 2010, President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner unilaterally dismissed the central bank governor for refusing to divert bank reserves to service government debt. Inflation, already running above 20%, accelerated further and eventually exceeded 50% by the end of that decade. Argentina has experienced more currency crises and bouts of extreme inflation than almost any other nation in the Western Hemisphere, and the common thread running through these episodes is the subordination of monetary policy to short-term political objectives. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, and numerous other nations have traveled similar paths, each demonstrating the same fundamental dynamic. When central banks lose independence, inflation expectations become unanchored. When expectations become unanchored, actual inflation accelerates. When inflation accelerates beyond a certain threshold, it creates its own political pressures for further monetary accommodation, as governments struggle to finance their operations and populations demand relief from rising costs. This creates a vicious cycle that can only be broken through immense economic pain, typically in the form of a severe recession, the wholesale destruction of financial assets denominated in the domestic currency, and often the complete collapse of political regimes that prove incapable of managing the crisis they created. What makes the current American situation particularly concerning from a systemic risk perspective is not that a single inflation episode is imminent, but that the structural safeguards against such an episode are being systematically challenged. The Trump administration's argument before the Supreme Court was not merely that Lisa Cook should be removed for alleged misconduct. The administration argued that the president's determination of cause is unreviewable by courts, that no hearing or due process is required, and that courts have no role to play in assessing whether removal decisions comply with statutory requirements. As Justice Kavanaugh observed, accepting this argument would effectively eliminate the distinction between for-cause removal protection and at-will employment. If the president can cite any allegation, regardless of timing or merit, and if no court can review whether that allegation satisfies the statutory standard, then Fed governors serve at presidential pleasure in everything but name. All 3 living former Fed chairs, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and Janet Yellen, filed amicus briefs with the Supreme Court warning against this outcome. Economists who submitted briefs to the court warned explicitly that granting the administration's stay request could trigger a recession. Justice Amy Coney Barrett asked the Solicitor General directly how the court should weigh the public interest given these warnings from economic experts. The administration's response was essentially that the president's assessment of cause should be unreviewable regardless of economic consequences. This position, if adopted, would fundamentally restructure the relationship between political authority and monetary policy in the United States in ways that markets would immediately recognize. The market implications of a ruling favorable to the administration are difficult to overstate. The Federal Reserve's credibility as an independent institution is currently priced into every dollar-denominated asset in the global financial system. Treasury bonds carry yields that reflect not just current inflation expectations, but expectations about the Fed's long-term commitment to price stability. Corporate borrowing costs, mortgage rates, the dollar's value against other currencies. All of these prices incorporate assumptions about the structural independence of American monetary policy, a Supreme Court ruling that effectively eliminated for-cause protection for Fed governors would not merely affect Lisa Cook's employment status. It would trigger a fundamental reassessment of the inflation risk premium embedded in dollar-denominated assets worldwide. This is the structural mechanism by which wealth destruction happens. It does not require hyperinflation. It does not require Zimbabwe-style currency collapse. It merely requires a sufficient increase in the inflation risk premium demanded by global investors to hold dollar-denominated assets. If that premium increases by even modest amounts, the present value of existing fixed-income assets falls correspondingly. Bond portfolios, pension funds, insurance company reserves, and bank capital all suffer immediate mark-to-market losses. Equity valuations that depend on discount rates tied to interest rates adjust downward. Real estate values that depend on financing costs come under pressure. None of this requires actual inflation to materialize. It merely requires the rational expectation that inflation might materialize because the institutional constraints against it have been weakened. The justices who questioned the administration on Wednesday appeared to understand this dynamic at some level, which explains their apparent skepticism toward the administration's maximalist claims. Justice Kavanaugh's observation that what goes around comes around was particularly telling. If the current president can fire Fed governors based on pretextual allegations with no judicial review, then so can every future president. The result would be a Federal Reserve whose policy decisions are constrained by the knowledge that any decision displeasing to the White House could result in summary removal. No central banker operating under such constraints could credibly commit to inflation-fighting policies that might be politically unpopular. And without that credible commitment, the anchor on inflation expectations that has kept American prices relatively stable for 4 decades would begin to slip. What most observers miss about situations like this is the timing dynamic. The consequences of structural institutional erosion are not linear. They do not manifest gradually in proportion to the degree of erosion. Instead, they tend to remain latent for extended periods before manifesting suddenly and dramatically when some triggering event causes markets to update their assessments of institutional credibility. This is why wealth destruction events often feel sudden to those experiencing them, even though the structural preconditions were visible for years to those paying attention. The residents of Turkey did not experience gradually accelerating inflation proportional to each incremental reduction in central bank independence. They experienced relative stability until they did not, at which point the adjustment was swift and devastating. The Supreme Court appears unlikely to rule in the administration's favor, at least based on the tenor of Wednesday's oral arguments. But the mere fact that the question is being litigated, that a sitting president has for the first time in 112 years attempted to remove a Fed governor, that criminal investigations have been opened against the Fed chair, and that the Justice Department has served subpoenas on the central bank represents a stress test of institutional architecture that has never been applied before. Market participants are watching. Foreign central banks are watching. Holders of dollar-denominated reserves worldwide are watching. The lesson of economic history is that institutional credibility erodes at the margins before it collapses at the center. The margins are being tested now. The appropriate framework for understanding these events is not one of prediction, but one of structural analysis. Systems that evolved over decades to prevent particular categories of catastrophic outcomes do not persist by accident. They persist because they serve functions that, while invisible during normal times, become essential during periods of stress. Central bank independence is one such structure. It exists because the alternative, politically directed monetary policy, has been tried repeatedly and has failed repeatedly in ways that impose enormous costs on ordinary citizens who bear no responsibility for the policy errors. The 1970s American experience, the Turkish experience, the Argentine experience, the Venezuelan experience all represent data points in a natural experiment that has been running for a century across dozens of countries. The conclusion of that experiment is unambiguous. J.P. Morgan Research currently estimates a 35% probability of recession in the United States in 2026. The Brookings Institution's scholars have written explicitly that Federal Reserve independence must be preserved and that there are no easy shortcuts to fiscal sustainability. Allianz Global Investors warns that the Fed's institutional independence may be tested by legal challenges and political pressure. These assessments are being made by institutions whose business depends on accurate assessment of economic conditions. They are not engaging in political commentary. They are incorporating institutional risk into their baseline forecasts. The wealth destruction that results from compromised monetary institutions is not evenly distributed. Those with the resources to move assets offshore, to denominate savings in multiple currencies, to hedge against inflation through real assets, suffer least. Those who cannot, which means most ordinary workers and retirees whose savings are denominated in dollars and whose incomes are fixed in nominal terms, suffer most. This is the bitter irony of policies ostensibly designed to help ordinary people through lower interest rates. The immediate beneficiaries of rate cuts may indeed be borrowers seeking lower mortgage payments or businesses seeking cheaper financing. But the long-term costs of inflation fall disproportionately on those least able to protect themselves, on workers whose wages lag price increases, on retirees whose fixed incomes lose purchasing power, on savers whose accumulated wealth erodes in real terms. At this stage of the cycle, the structural trajectory points toward continued pressure on Federal Reserve independence, regardless of how the Supreme Court rules in the immediate case. The administration has demonstrated its willingness to use every available lever of power to influence monetary policy, from attempted firings to criminal investigations to public attacks on Fed leadership. Even if Cook remains in her position and Powell continues as chair through the end of his term, the precedent has been established that future administrations can and will apply similar pressure. The question is whether the institutional architecture proves resilient enough to withstand these pressures, or whether it eventually yields in ways that fundamentally alter the inflation dynamics of the American economy. The historical parallel most observers are missing is not the 1970s, though that parallel is instructive. It is the 1930s, when central banks worldwide abandoned the gold standard constraints that had previously anchored monetary policy, and governments gained direct control over money creation. The immediate result was recovery from the Depression, but the longer-term result was decades of monetary instability in countries that failed to develop alternative institutional constraints on inflationary policy. The countries that eventually achieved stable low inflation did so by granting their central banks legal independence and insulating them from political pressure. This was not ideological commitment, but learned experience, the hard-won recognition that monetary stability requires institutions capable of resisting short-term political temptation. The Supreme Court's eventual ruling will matter for Lisa Cook's position and for the immediate trajectory of Fed policy. But the larger question is whether the United States is moving toward or away from the institutional architecture that has sustained monetary stability for 4 decades. The forces pushing toward politicization of monetary policy are powerful and unlikely to disappear, regardless of how individual legal cases resolve. The consequences of yielding to those forces are visible in the experiences of every nation that has traveled this path before. They did not enjoy the journey, and their populations paid prices measured not in abstract economic statistics, but in destroyed savings, impoverished retirements, and deferred dreams. This is the frame through which to understand what is unfolding, not as political drama, though it is that, not as constitutional law, though it is that too, but as a stress test of institutional structures that were built to prevent outcomes that feel impossible until they arrive. The mathematics of inflation dynamics, the mechanics of expectations anchoring, the historical record of politically directed monetary policy, all point toward the same conclusion. The question is whether the institutions prove stronger than the pressures being applied to them. History suggests this is not a question whose answer should be assumed.